In June 1969, two Central American countries went to war. Bombs fell, fighter jets clashed in the sky. Thousands of soldiers crossed a border under fire. Within days, the fighting had killed an estimated 2,000 people and displaced well over 100,000 more.
And when historians and journalists tried to explain what had actually caused it, the story that spread around the world was almost too strange to believe. A war that started because of a soccer match.
That headline wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't exactly false either. This is the real story of the football war, one of the strangest and most misunderstood conflicts of the 20th century, and the real political pressure cooker that a soccer rivalry accidentally lit on fire.
To understand what really happened in 1969, you have to forget the soccer match for a moment and look at the actual root of the conflict: land, and who was living on it.
El Salvador in the late 1960s was one of the smallest and most densely populated countries in the Western Hemisphere. A small nation where land ownership was concentrated among a wealthy elite, leaving huge numbers of poor rural Salvadorans with little or no land of their own to farm.
Honduras, right next door, was far larger and much less densely populated, with significant amounts of undeveloped land. Over the course of several decades, hundreds of thousands of Salvadorans, by some estimates as many as 300,000, had migrated across the border into Honduras, searching for farmland and better economic opportunity that simply wasn't available at home.
For years, this migration was tolerated, even if it created underlying tension. But by the late 1960s, Honduras was facing its own internal pressures. Economic struggles, land reform disputes among Honduran citizens, and a military government looking for ways to diffuse domestic political frustration.
In 1969, the Honduran government enacted a sweeping land reform law that specifically targeted undocumented Salvadoran migrants, stripping many of them of land they had farmed for years, sometimes for entire generations, and forcibly deporting large numbers of them back across the border into El Salvador.
Tens of thousands of Salvadoran families arrived back in a country that had never had enough land for them in the first place, arriving with nothing and with deep resentment toward the Honduran government that had expelled them. This is the real story: a border crisis, a refugee crisis, and a wave of nationalist anger already boiling in both countries. And then, that same summer, their national soccer teams were drawn against each other in the qualifying rounds for the 1970 World Cup.
The World Cup qualifier between El Salvador and Honduras was structured as a two-leg format, with a third match to break the tie if needed. And given how much political tension already existed between the two nations, it's almost hard to imagine a worse possible moment for a high-stakes national sporting rivalry.
The first match took place in the Honduran capital, Tegucigalpa, on June 8, 1969. Honduras won 1-0. Reports from the Salvadoran side described their team facing hostile crowds and a genuinely intimidating atmosphere. And according to widely repeated accounts from the time, at least one Salvadoran fan reportedly took her own life after the loss, an event that, whether fully verified or not, became a powerful symbol in Salvadoran media of just how emotionally charged the rivalry had already become. The second match was played a week later in the Salvadoran capital, San Salvador, and this time the atmosphere turned openly hostile before the game even started. Salvadoran fans reportedly surrounded the hotel where the Honduran team was staying the night before the match, keeping them awake with noise for hours in an apparent effort to exhaust the visiting players. El Salvador won the match 3-0,
and violence broke out around the stadium and across the city afterward. Attacks on Honduran nationals living in El Salvador and a wave of similar retaliatory violence against Salvadoran migrants back in Honduras.
Diplomatic relations between the two countries, already strained from the migration crisis, began to collapse entirely. The third and deciding match was moved to neutral territory in Mexico City on June 27th. El Salvador won in extra time, 3-2, securing their spot in the World Cup. But by that point, the soccer result almost didn't matter anymore. The violence surrounding each match had already escalated tensions between the two governments to a breaking point that had very little left to do with sports. Just days after that final match, El Salvador formally severed diplomatic relations with Honduras, citing what it described as systematic mistreatment and violent persecution of Salvadoran citizens living in Honduran territory. 11 days later, El Salvador launched a full military invasion. On July 14, 1969, Salvadoran military aircraft launched attacks on Honduran airfields and military targets, while ground troops crossed the border into Honduran territory along multiple fronts. For a war that lasted just about 100 hours from start to ceasefire, it was intense and genuinely destructive. The Salvadoran Air Force targeted Honduran military infrastructure directly, while ground forces made rapid advances into Honduran territory, capturing several towns near the border in the war's opening days. Honduras responded with its own air force, and in an unusual historical footnote, this brief war became known for including some of the last combat engagements in history between piston-engine, propeller-driven fighter aircraft, World War II-era planes like the P-51 Mustang and F-4U Corsair, still in service with both countries' air forces, engaging each other in what are considered among the final dogfights of that aircraft era before jets fully took over. On the ground, the fighting was brutal, but geographically contained, concentrated mostly along the border region. Civilian casualties mounted quickly, particularly as Honduran authorities and civilian mobs, in the chaotic days following the invasion, targeted Salvadoran migrants still living in Honduras. Violence and mass expulsions that added significantly to the war's overall human toll, beyond the direct military casualties on both sides. International pressure moved fast. The Organization of American States intervened diplomatically within days, and by July 18th, less than a week after the invasion began, a ceasefire was formally arranged, with El Salvador agreeing to withdraw its troops from Honduran territory. In that short span of roughly 100 hours, estimates suggest around 2,000 people were killed, the vast majority of them Honduran civilians and Salvadoran migrants caught in the surrounding violence and mass expulsions, alongside several hundred military casualties on both sides. Here's the part of this story that rarely makes it into the soccer war headlines. The war didn't actually resolve anything. The underlying land and migration crisis that had caused the tension in the first place remained completely unresolved. If anything, it got dramatically worse. An estimated 100,000 or more Salvadoran migrants who had been living in Honduras were displaced entirely during and after the conflict, flooding back into an El Salvador that already had far too little land to support its existing population. That sudden influx of displaced, landless people back into an already land-scarce country is widely considered by historians to be one of the significant underlying factors that deepened El Salvador's internal economic and political tensions over the following decade. Tensions that would eventually help fuel the devastating Salvadoran Civil War that began in 1979. A conflict that would go on to kill an estimated 75,000 people over the following 12 years. Trade between Honduras and El Salvador,
both members of the Central American Common Market at the time, collapsed almost entirely after the war, damaging both economies for years afterward. Formal diplomatic relations between the two nations would not be fully normalized again for over a decade.
In other words, a war fought in the public imagination over a soccer match actually left the real underlying crisis worse than it had been before. A pattern historians see repeatedly in conflicts where a visible, dramatic trigger event obscures the much slower-moving, less telegenic root causes underneath it. So why did the world end up calling this the football war or soccer war at all, if the real causes were about land, migration, and decades of unresolved political pressure? Much of the credit or blame for that framing goes to a single, extremely influential piece of journalism, a widely read essay written by the Polish journalist Ryszard Kapuczynski, who covered the conflict and later wrote about it in a way that emphasized the soccer rivalry as a dramatic narrative device, framing the sporting matches as the spark that ignited the war. It made for a genuinely compelling story, and it wasn't entirely wrong, since the soccer matches really did serve as a visible flashpoint that accelerated an already deteriorating relationship into open warfare. But the framing that took hold in international media afterward flattened a much more complicated political and economic crisis into a simple, almost absurd headline: a war over a soccer game. That simplified version spread rapidly because it was memorable, ironic, and easy to summarize, while the more accurate, more complicated story about land reform, mass migration, and regional economic tension required far more context to actually explain. It's a pattern worth recognizing beyond just this one conflict. Dramatic, simple explanations for historical events tend to survive in public memory far longer than the messier, more accurate versions underneath them. Today, El Salvador and Honduras maintain normal diplomatic and economic relations, and the border dispute that helped trigger the war was eventually resolved through international legal arbitration decades later in the 1990s, largely settling the territorial questions that had remained unresolved since the conflict. But the deeper legacy of the football war isn't really about soccer at all. It's a reminder of how quickly underlying political and economic pressure, land scarcity, mass migration, and unresolved national resentment can erupt into open conflict once a visible spark appears, even one as seemingly trivial as a sporting rivalry. The soccer matches didn't cause the war. They revealed, in front of the entire world, just how close two nations already were to war before a single ball was even kicked. If you want to see how this conflict connects to the brutal civil war that followed in El Salvador a decade later, let me know in the comments and subscribe for the next chapter in this story.